Good afternoon. Welcome to the House. All right, and again. Good afternoon and welcome to the House Committee on Environment and Energy. This afternoon, we're going to continue our testimony on H289 and act relating to the renewable energy standard. And we're welcoming Elizabeth Schilling from the Public Utility Commission. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. For the record, Elizabeth Schilling. I'm a Deputy General Counsel and Hearing Officer at the Public Utility Commission. I did see that a draft 3.1 has been posted to the committee's webpage. I know your legislative council, I don't think has walked through that with you yet. So would you prefer me to work off of draft 2.1 or draft 3.1? 2.1?
Oh, no, I guess
3.1?
you have if you're ready to speak to 3.1.
And it might take me a minute to like identify pages or whatever, because I identified the pages in the draft 2.1, but it might not be important. So I'll try and work from draft 3.1.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep. So today I'm going to focus on general areas of concern and areas that the commission has noted may need additional clarification or further explanation and testimony. So to begin, the commission is concerned by how complicated and nuanced the RES tiers have become. This will make implementation and ensuring and verifying utility compliance a much more difficult and time-consuming process for both the commission and the department. Next, the commission would like to note that these changes would necessitate updates to both the net metering rule and the renewable energy standard rule. And under the Administrative Procedure Act, the formal rulemaking process normally takes 6 to 7 months at a minimum. So it would be helpful for these bills to either provide an expedited rulemaking process for any updates necessitated, or acknowledge the time that it takes for formal rulemaking and adjust effective dates as necessary.
All right, can you say that one more time? It would be helpful if it did
We could either provide for an expedited rulemaking process. So sometimes in statute, it identifies we don't have to follow this step and this step of the Administrative Procedure Act. We just follow this step. So for example, with the clean heat standard rulemaking, that provided an expedited rulemaking process, skipping certain steps in the Administrative Procedure Act rulemaking, because it does take 6 to 8 months to do rulemaking. And we would need some of these changes in place when the law went into effect. So January 1 of 2025. Shall I proceed? Okay, so from here, I'm going to go section by section. So I'm going to start with section 2 that amends some of the definitions. So the first definition that the commission is concerned about is the proposed changes to the net metering system definition. So the commission is concerned they are not clear enough and may not fully eliminate group net metering. That's the intention of the language. And I did see that there are some changes that have been proposed in draft 3.1 to that definition, but they still may not go far enough to fully eliminate net metering. And it's very important that if that's the intent, that there's not any ambiguity, because that would put the commission at real litigation risk. And we don't want there to be any ambiguity if we're implementing this type of massive change. So the next is the new renewable energy definition.
Excuse me, would you offer a change to that definition that would clarify it?
So I don't have a change in writing today, but if you were interested in some proposed changes, I could go back, confer with colleagues, and provide some written suggestions to Legislative Council. So next is the new renewable energy definition. So the commission just wanted to note that expanding the tiers that a facility is eligible for under the RES. So in other words, allowing facilities commissioned between January 1st, 2010 and June 30th of 2015 to be new renewable energy will require work on the part of the commission. So entities that are currently eligible for tier 1 and wish to be eligible for tier 2 or tier 4 will need to register with the commission or otherwise be identified, so the commission can provide that updated information to NEPOOL GIS, which is the tracking system for the RECs, so that the RECs can be appropriately tracked. So that's just a piece of work that we just want to identify. You know, it just doesn't automatically happen. The RECs have to be appropriately tracked.
Can you hold on 1 second? Dylan, would you mind closing that door, please? And Representative Sibilia.
Elizabeth, will you be offering this as written testimony?
I can also provide what I've typed up, if that would be helpful.
That would be very helpful.
I just finished it shortly before coming, so I hadn't had time to submit it to the committee.
Yeah, helpful to have that in writing. Thanks.
Okay, so next is moving on to the low income customer definition. So the commission would suggest moving this definition to the section regarding the alternative compliance payments going towards low income customers. So that definition is just used one place in the bill. It's in section 4, I believe. It might be section 3 now. So there's already a definition of low income customer that's in the RES rule, the Renewable Energy Standard rule. And that's used for different purposes. It's used for tracking spending on tier 3 energy transformation projects that benefit customers with low income. And the rule uses a slightly different definition. The rule uses household income at 80% of Vermont statewide median income, which is one number. And we use that for tracking purposes. So we just wouldn't want there to be a different definition in this rule, or if there was, we'd need to update our rule accordingly, and it might require more updates in our rule because we've got this one number that is easy for us to use. So the next definition is the load definition. So the commission doesn't believe the intent of this language is for the load to include behind the meter solar, net metering solar consumption. However, as the definition is currently written, it's not completely clear whether or not the behind the meter net metering solar consumption would be included in load. So the commission would recommend clarifying that definition so it's explicit. Okay, so moving on to section 4 of the bill. So this is the section regarding the updates to the RES tiers. So starting with tier 2. So there's language under this section to allow GlobalFoundries to petition to meet tier 2 with resources greater than 5 megawatts for a period greater than a year. There's language in this section that's unclear, so it might be helpful to just go to the language. It was on page 15 of an earlier draft. I think it's on page 11 now, actually. Yeah, okay. So I think it's the bottom of page 11 onto page 12. But it says it has only one retail electricity customer take service at 115 kilovolts on property owned or controlled by the customer as of January 1st, 2024. So obviously this is referring to GlobalFoundries, but the language on property owned or controlled by the customer as of January 1st, 2024 is not used everywhere GlobalFoundries was referenced. So it's unclear why it's used here. So if there's a specific intent behind the language, it should be clarified. I'm actually going to come back to this language when I talk about tier 4. So it may have something to do with what's being done in tier 4, but it just was unclear what the intent is of that language here. So I wanted to point that out. Next is under tier 3. It amends tier 3 energy transformation projects to allow utilities to exceed the statutorily required amounts under tier 3. So the commission wanted to note that this is already permissible. So utilities often exceed their requirements in a given year, and then they bank their excess credits for use in future years. So the commission's not concerned about that. That's already something that's happening. But what the commission is concerned about is the language which says the commission shall not hold imprudent any retail electricity provider expenditure to support energy transformation projects or measures based on the expenditure being above and beyond what is statutorily required, provided the projects and measures otherwise comply with statute and commission rules. So currently projects have to be below the alternative compliance payment. So we set a rate, and for each megawatt hour equivalent reduction, to get that reduction, it has to be less than the alternative compliance payment. So it appears this provision would give utilities a blank check for unfettered spending on tier 3 projects. So it'd be helpful to establish sidebars regarding the appropriate level of spending on tier 3 measures. The commission understands that the alternative compliance payment limit could be an impediment to providing tier 3 measures to customers with low income. So we'd be interested in seeing language that would be more narrowly tailored to that issue. So that's been brought to the commission's attention before, that the alternative compliance payment rate makes it hard to provide higher incentives for low income customers. But this language is much broader than that. So next, moving on to tier 4. So this is going back to the global foundries language that was a bit ambiguous. So it's under tier 4, it would allow global foundries to use tier 4 to satisfy tier 2 if global foundries did not have sufficient tier 2 facilities located on its campuses by January 1, 2024. So it's unclear why this date is January 1 of 2024, because GMP is going to supply power to and comply with the RES on Global Foundries' behalf until September 30th of 2026. So it seems like September 30th of 2026 would actually be the more appropriate date there, because right now GMP is doing all of their RES compliance. So moving on, I think the next is regarding the RES report, which is the next section, I believe.
Representative Stebbins has a question.
Sure.
Well, actually, it's more a comment, if that's okay. I could be wrong on this, but my understanding was for the January 1, 2024, that was so that if they had like solar already on their property, that it couldn't then be counted. But if it's unclear to you,
To the
then
best of my knowledge, they don't currently have solar. They're in the process of proposing some facilities.
or if they have something that could, meet requirements. So we should find out more.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So moving on to section 5, this is the Renewable Energy Program report. So the commission agrees with the department that the report should not be a joint report. The commission could certainly conduct a non-contested case process and would recommend that either the department be the author of the whole report or the department author the parts of the report under B1 through 3 that they typically do, and then the commission author the part of the report regarding GMP compliance with tier 4. So just making it clear who the authors are of what sections of the report. And then finally, moving on to section 7, this is regarding the changes to the net metering section. So first on pages, I have 4 pages, but the changes would allow all the utilities other than GMP to use RECs from existing net metering systems of less than 150 kW. If the utility has not been informed that the environmental attributes have been sold or otherwise retired. This language is problematic because it could result in double counting. System owners need to consent to the transfer transfer their RECs to the utility. For example, some owners could have previously transferred their RECs to their system installer for the installer to sell them. So it's not appropriate to assume that the RECs are just available for the utility to count. Having consent to the transfer is appropriate to prevent double counting. And then finally, there are references. I wish I was able to track the pages closely. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, maybe it's been fixed. I think it's actually been fixed in this draft. So never mind. Ellen fixed it. So
Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'm not necessarily advocating for this, but we've heard concern about chasing down consent forms that may not have been the verbiage or the way it was framed. Is like a double negative a form of consent? So if there was a statement sent out that said, we are assuming these are not counted unless you notify us otherwise, and thank you so much for your consent unless you notify. Does that ever count?
I'm
just curious.
still be concerned that that system owners would just choose not to, I sold my RECs a long time ago to my installer. Why do I need to contact the utility? Yeah, I'm just concerned that there would be double counting.
Thank you for your testimony. Any further questions, members?
And I'm going to stick around. So if anyone has any questions.
Just to reiterate, to send that to.
Yes, I wrote that down. So I will make sure to submit my written testimony.
Thank you. Right. Now we have Shauna.
Shayna. We'll get there. Loisel.
Velco, I can do Velco.
Thank you. Right. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting us back to provide testimony on the Renewable Energy Standard Reform Bill. I apologize we couldn't be here on Wednesday with the rest of the working group, myself and Hans Presame, who's joining me here today. We were attending the Vermont System Planning Committee, but I was told that there was some recognition of that meeting and some of the information that came out of that meeting. So my intent today was to recapture some comments that I made last week and then introduce Hans Presame, our Director of Transmission Planning, to present some slides that put some of the work of the long-range transmission planning specific to how we see hosting distributed generation on the system, putting that into context with some of the data that was received through the analysis for the 2024 long-range transmission plan. So to start with, just it's always good to differentiate Velco being a bit of a different utility. We are the transmission grid operator. Our role is to manage and operate the high voltage transmission system. Our responsibility is for delivering reliable power, whether in-state or out-of-state, among Vermont's distribution utilities through our interconnections or ties. Sometimes we use those interchangeably with our neighboring states and Canada. And this is a very critical role that Hans's presentation will highlight through the data and the maps that you see. So as noted last week, Velco is a federal regulated utility. And so given our regulation and our structure, we are neutral on the bill as it's drafted. However, we think it's important for the committee as it considers these policies to understand where the current state of the grid is and where we see it going. And that is really the intent of Hans's presentation today and comments. Because this is a grid that is being transformed, and it's why we'd like to highlight portions of the long-range transmission plan analysis. It is not a comprehensive overview of the plan. We would welcome the opportunity to come back to provide a more comprehensive review of the other portions of the plan, because those are just as important. It's the other portions are talking about how we need to serve peak load over the next 10 and 20 years. Today's excerpts will be more focused on renewable integration. And so those excerpted slides will provide a few key takeaways that we'd like to offer for your consideration as you work on this bill. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'd love to really yield my time over to Hans Presame to dig into some of that data of the plan.
Members have questions? Well, thank you for that offer to come back. We'll take you up on that.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so Hans, I can do the slides for you, but before you begin, and I know you love me asking you to do this, but if you would please, it'd be wonderful if you could share with the committee your background and work that you've done around transmission planning. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Shayna. Good afternoon, everybody. For the record, my name is Hans Presame. I'm the Director of Transmission System Planning at Velco. And as a way of background, I started my career at Boston Edison. I worked as a transmission planner for about 10 years. And then I met my wife, who's French Canadian, and then I moved to Vermont about 2001, I think. And so for the past 23 years now, I've been a transmission planner at Velco. And so I've commuted back and forth between Vermont and Quebec on a weekly basis since then. So as I look back on my career, I think I've been fortunate to work with with great people and challenging problems. I'm one of the few experienced planners in New England who have actually seen the system evolve from a vertically integrated utility system to a more distributed system where generators that are serving our loads are invisible to the grid planner, invisible to the operator. And so as we decarbonize the grid, as this is really accelerating, the system is transforming right in front of us. What has remained unchanged really is the need to maintain grid reliability at an affordable cost. Cost is generally an issue we pay attention to. And so in this presentation, what I will talk about is how solar PV has been affecting the system. And then I'll give a sort of brief summary of the results of our analysis, distributed generation hosting analysis that we conducted as part of the 2024 long-range transition plan. And so Shana, if you could move to slide 2, please.
Sure.
Okay. So what you see in the screen here is an overview of the in-state generation resources that we depend on today. And you'll see that most of our resources are renewable, but they're also intermittent and weather dependent. We have about more than 1,000 megawatt of installed capacity or installed nameplate capacity in the state. And I would say maybe more than 80% of that is weather dependent. But the fastest growing technology in the last few years has been solar PV. You see it highlighted here at about 500 megawatt as of the end of 2023, and it's growing really fast at the pace of about 30 or 40 megawatts a year. So when you compare that to our peak load, whether it's winter peak or summer peak, we have quite a bit of generation, and just the solar itself is over 40% penetration compared to the state peak. And to put that into context, Massachusetts, which has about, say, 3,000 megawatts of solar, that's only 20% of the Massachusetts peak, and all the other states are 15% or lower. So we are doing much better than all the states in New England. Next slide, please, Shana. And this is showing the winter and summer peaks from the last 10 years. But we're also showing here is the timing of that peak. In the winter, we typically peak around 6 p.m. or hour 18. In the summer, we have seen a change since 2015 where solar PV has successfully served load in the middle of the day. So it has reduced the summer peak, which tends to occur at 2 o'clock or 2 p.m. And now summer is peaking at 8 p.m. And it's lower than the past. And so solar has been really successful at reducing our peak. But what it also did is the new solar, incremental solar, will have no impact on the peak because of that timing. Next slide, please, Shana. And the other effects that we see is a sort of a more pronounced effect when the load in Vermont is low. And that tends to happen in the springtime period in April, May. And so this graph is showing that our loads have been, the net load that the transmission system sees, it's been dropping progressively every year from about 600 megawatt in 2014 to close to 100 megawatts. So that's really about 50 megawatt a year that it's dropping. We'll see a negative load pretty soon, within 5 years for sure. Next slide, Shana. And this is another picture of how much load, how much that we're importing from our neighbors. Typically, when the Vermont system load is high, like the winter peak or summer peak, we are importing most of that power from our neighbors. When the load is low in the springtime period, that import level is lower. In fact, last year, for the first time since 2014, we have started to export energy to our neighbors. And so in May 6, it was minus 63 that we are able to export to other states. Next slide, Shana. And just to put that into perspective, as I was noting earlier, the maximum amount of imports into the state hasn't changed very much. It's about 850 megawatts a year, but the minimum import tends to occur in the spring has been dropping every year due to solar PV. And last year, we've exported for the first time, minus 63 out of our state. Next slide, Shana. And so at the peak hour, these pie charts are showing what we're importing on our ties versus the amount of generation that's within the states or in-state units. All the technologies are noted here. And so looking at these pie charts, I would say less than a quarter of the Vermont load is being served by in-state resources. And it's really because of the type of resources that we use in Vermont. They're certainly renewable, but they're also weather dependent. And solar as a technology, the timing simply doesn't work for solar. It's after dark, and so we get no support at the peak hour. Next slide, Sina. Just wanted to spend a minute on this slide here. I think you're familiar with an area called Sheffield Highgate Export Interface, or SHEI, where generators are curtailed from time to time because there's not enough transmission capacity to export that power to the rest of Vermont. And the way that the ISO New England, the operator, manages that is to curtail existing resources. And I want to talk about this because as we add more and more renewable energy, we are going to start to see this type of issue elsewhere on the system. And the ability to manage that is going to be an issue. It could be certainly done by storage, but one tool that the ISO New England has is to curtail the generators that it has control of. And so anticipating that issue, we are considering a number of upgrades, or we have some initiatives where we want to upgrade a line we call the K42 line, or Franklin County line. And K42 is being pursued, and we believe it will be implemented in the next 2 years. And that should help this area to either use existing resources or actually add more renewables in northern Vermont. Next slide, Shana. And so to go into the analysis that we did for the long-range plan, we have forecast the amount of solar that we'll see in the future. Currently, we have about 500 megawatts. And based on existing economics, the various programs in the state, what's naturally occurring is the orange line, where we're essentially moved from 500 megawatts to about 600, maybe 700 megawatts. So this will be higher than the requirements of Tier 2 of the RES program. But around 2030 or so, we're going to be short of the obligations, and therefore we'd have to procure more solar PV or other resources to meet the requirements. And what we've done in this analysis is actually to test a scenario where we have doubled the Tier 2 requirements to 20%. And if we're going to use solar PV exclusively, or 90% or more, then the amount of in-state nameplate is going to be around 1,300 megawatts. And so we're testing from 500 to 1300 in our analysis, and I'll go over some of the results with you in the next few slides. So if you can move to the next slide, please, Shana. And so this is a summary, kind of results of our analysis. Again, the assumptions are important. And what we did is we modeled a spring light load level, as I showed you in the duck curve, where in the springtime period, it's about 600 megawatts in the middle of the day. So we bumped that up a little bit to 650. But we're not assuming that there will be future upgrades in the system. So we test the system as it is today, as we know it. And a critical assumption as well is that we're not reducing imports from our neighbors, from Canada and from New York. So we take the same amount here. And we're also not reducing existing renewables, whether the wind or hydro, to make room for new renewables. So all the additional solar PV is on top of the existing resources. And what then happened is the transmission lines on the western side of the state, indicated here in orange, exceed their capacity. And so we're noting that here for you. It's about 156 miles of transmission lines. And the blue circles indicate where our transformers that connect transmission to sub-transmission also overload. And so at this stage of the analysis, we don't conduct detailed engineering. And so any cost estimates that you see in our long-range plan are really order of magnitude estimates, where we use dollars per mile. I think in this case, we've used 7.7 million per mile for transmission. So those numbers are higher than you'd see typically. We're being really conservative here. But to put that into context, we've seen transmission projects proposed in New England. There's HVDC project, import power from Canada. I mean, they're on the order of $5 billion or $6 billion. And so, yes, transmission is costly. And that's why we try to avoid or postpone these projects as much as we can through different means, including, in this case, storage, maybe load management. I think curtailment of generation may be appropriate here as well. So there are various ways of dealing with these issues. But at some point, transmission may be required. One thing I want to note before I leave this slide is that ISO New England has rules about sort of determining aggregate impacts of distributed generation. And so they look for a saturation level of about 20 megawatts at a substation or an area that would trigger a need for transmission studies. We call those cluster studies. And this is where ISO New England will identify any system issues as distributed generation is growing in the state. So this will come in gradually as, you won't see 156 miles all of a sudden. You might see an upgrade in Addison County, for instance, or the central area, depending on how much solar comes in and at what rate of growth that we see.
We have a couple of questions on this slide. First, Representative Stebbins, and then Pat.
Thanks, Madam Chair.
Of course.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. Hope you're well. The study assumption that HQ imports and New York imports would still be coming in, was that because you were trying to get like a worst case scenario for the study assumption? Or is that because that's like ISO New England market rules right now? Or like you've got to take HQ in New York and so therefore you've got to curtail what you have in state? Like, I'm just wondering if besides, is there a non-transmission alternative?
Sure.
Is this, just looking at the worst case scenario, what are the other tools in the toolbox for policymakers?
Of course. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yes, you're right. We're looking at worst case conditions. Worst case in the sense that additional imports from New York and Hydro-Quebec essentially take room or space on the transmission system for in-state resources. So we have modeled typical flows from New York and Canada. And of course, during sort of real-time conditions, the operators can sort of push back on these imports to the extent possible. Can't say for now whether that will be sort of 50% of the typical levels or 25%. And so what we do is we model the system as it is operating today and not take credit for operational means. But you're correct. That's available to the operator to manage flows into the system and address reliability issues.
Thank you. Representative Pat Ventori.
Thank you. My question has to do with the wording on the bottom of the slide about the solution, the hybrid solution, and specifically about curtailment. If it gets to curtailment, how do you choose or prioritize which in-state resources would be curtailed? My concern is in both in terms of the location, but also in terms of the type of generation, base load versus intermittent, et cetera.
Sure. Thank you. In terms of priority, I think what will happen is the operator will curtail the generators that it can dispatch, what it has visibility of. So generators that are in the market, and it doesn't matter what the technology is, whether it's hydro or wind or solar, ISO will use its market rules to determine which units need to be reduced. So it depends on the price offers into the market and the impact each unit has on the limiting facility, the constrained facility. And then beyond that, it's really, as I noted earlier, it could perhaps regulate imports from New York and Canada. The difficulty is going to be on how to manage resources that the operator has no visibility of. That's the really question that I cannot answer at this time. And so it's really going to be the visible generators, the ones that participate in the market, that will be the first to regulate.
Representative Tory.
Thank you. Just a question for you. Did you include the transportation electrification modeling in this?
Not specifically. Reason why is this is again the worst case condition where we're modeling a sort of middle of the day. It's more specifically our Saturday, it's at 2 o'clock, or Sunday at 1 p.m. when our consumption is low, which means what we're saying is on a weekend in the afternoon, your car EV will likely not charge at that time. You're in the springtime period will not be heating your house using heat pumps because it's not cold enough. And so that's why we are modeling 650 megawatt as a base. However, if there are programs or incentives to encourage customers to charge their cars in the middle of the day instead of at night when they come home, then that load will show up in the middle of the day, right? So it could be perhaps 100 megawatts or 50, and so that will help to the extent utilities can encourage the customers to charge their cars in the middle of the day. But we did not assume in this analysis that would occur.
Representative Stebbins. I have a question. I think you're the person I can ask this of. It's been on my mind. We know that our utilities are making contracts with certain generators. And I guess I'm curious about who manages the interface of like, and the, how do we know, or how does anyone know that they're using the amount they're contracting for and how that gets managed when you're just trying to balance the needs of the grid? Makes sense. That makes sense.
It does, and I'm not sure I have the answer to that question. We might take it back. I'm not aware of the I guess the market rules and how we manage this at Valco or ISO New England.
Okay.
Fortunately, I don't have an answer for that.
Was that a question for ISO?
I would say so, yes.
Right.
Yes.
Thanks. No.
Anything else? Yeah, anything else like, on this slide?
I think we're set. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Good. Move to the next slide, please, Shana. One assumption that we have in our analysis is we have assumed in this work that future solar PV will be distributed geographically in the same way as it is today. We have done this analysis a number of times, I think the last three long-range plans, and so what we've said is, each developer will act based on its own economics, based on available land or access to distribution, and because solar PV tend to develop more residential areas or population areas on rooftops, schools, businesses, we have assumed that solar will continue to grow in the same way as it is today, geographically. And since we've done this work a number of times now, it's been growth for the last 10 years, we've been able to show some snapshots here from 2014 on the upper left, 2018 to the right of that, 2021 lower left, and now 2023. And you'll see that certain regions of the state are becoming brighter, which indicates that these are where development is occurring. And if we look at the lower right map here, and if go back to the slide where it shows the transmission projects, it's really these developments, the distributed generation developments, are aligned with where we're seeing transmission facilities overload, and it's really what we expect to avoid that to the extent possible. And so in our analysis, we have attempted to show where transmission capacity exists today to accommodate a larger amount of solar PV. And in our analysis, the southern system is where we can accommodate much more generation. And as you move north, you have lower and lower capacity to accommodate new renewables. And so if we're able to optimize the distribution of generation in the state to either minimize or eliminate transmission upgrades, we can accommodate within Vermont around 1,050 megawatts if you're able to encourage developers to go in areas of the state where capacity exists. Next slide, please, Shannon. So these are the takeaways from our analysis. We are seeing that when we have lower load levels combined with high distributed generations, i.e. solar PV, we use our system to export power to our neighbors. And when it's after dark and there's no solar production, we use our transmission system to import the power into the state. And so going forward, to the extent we depend on solar PV as the resource for Vermont, we're going to continue to depend on the transmission system. And looking at historical data, we think solar has been great. It's done a really good job at reducing daytime peaks and moving the peak to nighttime. But as a result of that, any incremental solar PV will no longer be able to reduce our peaks. So we have to increase renewable energy, and it's critical for Vermont to do so, and other states. We have to decarbonize the grid, decarbonize the economy. And I think one way to do that is really to collaborate, to share data, and to innovate. There are a lot of smart people in Vermont, whether it's the utilities, the department, VIC, and other folks. They can work together to figure out how to solve this challenge, and we have to do that in a way that maintains reliability, that makes sure the electric prices are affordable, and that allows us to meet our sustainability goals. So the tools that we have right now, I mean, just a few of them here, is really to develop storage at scale. And we may have to curtail generation to the extent it's feasible and cost effective. We have to use the capabilities of the inverters that allows us to increase generation in the state. And then load management is a tool that we can use here for hosting more distributed generation or to serve peak load. We may need to upgrade the system. It's always possible. But we're gonna have to use a hybrid solution. All of those measures and programs are on the table to serve our needs and make sure we achieve our goals. So the word is really to collaborate, to coordinate, to share data, and to innovate. And we think that we are able to achieve our goals. And I think that's it for us. That's the last slide, Shana. And be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Hans.
The basic one, thank you for your presentations, it was very helpful. The previous, well, yeah, this slide that's still up, new solar won't reduce future peaks. That really what that means, it won't address future peak loads, right? I mean,
Right. Yes.
yeah. Okay, thank you. Representative Pat.
Just a concern going back to my previous question, which is going forward, I'm aware from past curtailments in the Shiai area where what in effect happened was some of the most economic renewable resources were curtailed, and the more expensive ones could not be curtailed. And that's a concern in terms of how we try to when curtailment has to happen, and I understand, at least for the time being, that's a possibility, how we make the choices about what gets curtailed. Thank you.
Thank you again for your testimony.
Thank you very much.
Ma'am.
Thank you, Hans.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Oh. All right. Next up, we have Billy Coster from the Agency of Natural Resources.
Good afternoon. My name is Billy Coster. I'm the Director of Planning and Policy for the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, and I oversee the agency's work in land use, energy, and I've been at the agency for just over 12 years and was at the Vermont Housing Conservation Board for a decade prior to that, working on land conservation. I've been asked to come and speak with you all today about ANR's role in the regulatory review project of energy siting cases in Vermont, to talk about the natural resource impacts we typically see associated with those projects, and then just to share some reflections on what you may keep in mind as you're thinking about changes to our renewable energy standard. And please feel free to stop me at any point with questions. Just a little background. ANR is a statutory party in Section 248 energy siting proceedings. The Public Utility Commission issues certificate of public good for these projects, and the agency is a party to those proceedings. We're not a decision maker, but we provide evidence and recommendations to the commission as to whether those projects comply with their environmental criteria. We often also issue our own permits from our Department of Environmental Conservation, such as stormwater and wetlands permits for those projects. We review all applications for ground-mounted energy projects, 15 kilowatts and larger, that come into the PUC. Each week, my office compiles those new applications and advance notices, which is kind of a precursor to the application that come into the PUC, and we circulate that information to over 100 technical staff in all three of our departments, who review those applications and provide us comments, questions, recommendations on how to improve the projects, and ultimately work with us in recommending permit conditions to the PUC. Not every one of those 100 individuals looks at every project. They span a broad range of expertises, from hazardous waste to water quality to wildlife. But we just make sure that everyone gets eyes on them in case something in their purview is raised by a particular project. We have a similar practice for Act 250 applications. We do a very parallel review process at the agency.
Maybe you're about to do this, but sense of scale on a 15 kilowatt ground mounted project, how much that would be acres wise or some other?
Let me answer a slightly different way. The PUC's net metering rule allows for a registration process for projects 15 kilowatts and smaller. So we don't even really see those. Those are a registration form that has very little information, no real site plan. The next category of projects, I think, is 15 to 50 kilowatts, and those applications have a little bit more information. So we do review those and look at them. But it's when you get to 50 or larger is when the application materials have become more robust and when we really do a more substantive review. I can say that a 500 kW project has roughly 3-acre footprint. So for those of you better than I, you can probably drill down.
500 kilowatts is, what'd you say, 3
acres? Yeah, so maybe like 100 kW is somewhere around an acre-ish, a little less than an acre. So, and it depends. It depends on the site, the layout, but 15 kilowatts quite small. We usually don't have any substantive comments for those. We really start weighing in usually in more of the 50 and up range. But if something small is proposed in a bad location, we certainly will comment.
And then how many, you said every week you're reviewing them, are there applications every week?
Typically, so for the applications that we review, which are those larger net metered projects and up through utility scale, it really ranges over the years. There's been years when we've had over 100, years where there's 70 or 80, years when it's closer down to 50. So it really fluctuates based on the federal incentives, where the state is in its arc of the net metered incentive. Most of these are net metered projects. And that's where we see the most kind of volatility in the number of projects. And we report on those numbers annually. And actually next Tuesday, I have the report due for the previous fiscal year. So I can certainly pull together those reports for you and provide you that information. So the number of projects certainly is an indicator of workload and complexity, but sometimes a small number of projects can be just as resource intensive as many simpler ones. But typically we have a project, and it's somewhat seasonal. There'll be more applications certain time of the year, others less, but we usually see at least 1 or 2 advance notices or applications each week. So we do that work, and then for each application that we receive, we assign it to either a planner or attorney in the secretary's office. And that person is effectively the project manager. They compile all the input that they get from the technical staff. They communicate that to the applicant, especially during the advance notice period, which is a 45-day period prior to submitting an application. It's a minimum 45 days that developers have to give notice to certain parties of their intent to file a certificate of public good application. We use that period to try to share information about the site, provide recommendations on how to reconfigure the project to make it less impactful, and share recommendations on what sort of information we want to see in their application when it all comes forward. So it's a good time to, in an informal way, kind of vet things and provide guidance to the development community.
How many planners and attorneys do you have on staff?
We have 3 planners. And they do both Act 250 and Section 248 work, as well as 248A, which is telecom. And then we have, I think we have about 6 litigation attorneys, probably 3 or 4 of them focus on a majority of their time on 248 matters. So the planners typically handle the telecom and the net metered work. And then the attorneys typically deal with the larger utility scale projects.
Thank you. Representative Torrey.
Thank you. Does A&R play a role in, at the community level with facilitating?
That's a great question. My next bullet on here is that we don't necessarily play a formal role facilitating community conversations. We do offer and provide technical assistance and guidance to developers, utilities, municipalities, concerned citizens. You know, if there's a community that's interested in developing, say, a community solar project, and they want to understand what the natural resource regulations are or the conditions of site, we'll certainly provide that. We really encourage that early engagement from developers. We find if we can start talking when people are just, you know, before they've even purchased a property, ideally, so we can help screen it for potential concerns. That's great, but at least before they've finalized their engineering, so we can provide some feedback. So yeah, we don't play a formal role in communities, but we certainly are a resource if folks want to call us. So, you know, we do that pre-development work, and then we're very engaged in the formal process itself. We do most of our review through the PUC's Section 248 criteria B5, which is their environmental criteria that sets a broad, no undue adverse impact standard on the natural environment. And it gives due consideration to many of Act 250's criteria. So many of Act 250 criteria are incorporated into reference into Section 248, as well as some additional considerations that are not covered in Act 250. You know, most of what we've seen in recent years for energy in Vermont is solar. We've certainly seen an ebb and flow of anaerobic digesters, both on farm and with different inputs. There hasn't been many wind projects moving into the regulatory framework for a number of years, so there have been a few applications floated recently. But the common natural resource constraints we found with these solar projects are, you know, potential wetland and wetland buffer impacts, potential impacts to riparian areas and streams. Typically, they may need a construction stormwater permit or potentially an operational stormwater permit for larger projects. Some sites may require a rare, threatened, and endangered plant survey, and if those populations are present, you know, we will often require avoidance or other measures such as invasive species controls to protect those populations. Often we see the potential for necessary wildlife habitat impacts. That's a defined Act 250 term. Typically, that's either deer wintering areas or increasingly grassland breeding bird habitat. And then, you know, occasionally we see potential impacts to things like significant natural communities or rare and irreplaceable natural areas, but those are less common. And, you know, occasionally projects can have the potential to impact forest blocks or connecting habitat. But again, those are really site specific and not something we see typically. We have seen a general increase over the last 5 years or so in forest clearing associated with larger net metered projects. And that's been a concern of ours, where a 500 kW project with a 3-acre footprint may be clearing 6, 7, 8, 9 acres of forest to address shading issues and access. And, you know, from our perspective, maybe that's not the best site to put one of these projects if alternatives exist. We are pleased to see that the Public Utility Commission recognized this concern, and then their recent update to the net metering rule put some provisions in place to reduce the incentives available to projects that have significant forest clearing. And Chair Sheldon had asked me earlier in the day, you know, do we track any of these impacts? And I did touch base with our Fish and Wildlife Department. They do track, you know, not in a very formal way, but they maintain some spreadsheets and databases around impacts to necessary wildlife habitat. So that's not only deer yards and grassland birds, but, you know, mast stands for beach and other, you know, wetlands that provide a food source for bears, like the range of necessary wildlife habitat, they do track those impacts. They track impacts to rare, threatened, and endangered plants. They do track forest clearing. That data was really helpful in the PUC conversation on net metering. And they do track the limit of disturbance of these projects. So we have a rough sense of the acreage impacts associated with the energy generation. But it's really, I really do want to note that, you know, while certain projects and sites still do raise some significant concerns from our agency, overall, we're in a much better place than we were in 2016 and 2017, when Vermont was seeing a real significant increase in deployment of solar around the state, where a lot of new companies were coming to Vermont who didn't have background in land use development in our laws. And at that time, there was just real pressure on our agency and the natural environment, on a lot of our communities trying to absorb that high rate of deployment. In the years since, you know, I think especially the solar industry has really matured. I really want to give credit to a lot of our in-state developers. They've taken the time to engage with our staff, to understand what our concerns are, to largely incorporate our guidance materials into their site selection, and have really minimized the number of contested cases we see. It's not to say that we still don't disagree about certain outcomes, and issues continue to rise that we do, you know, bump up against each other on. But overall, I think it's a much more stable environment where we're seeing a lot of good projects go forward without any issues or comments from our agency.
I'm gonna just backtrack for one sec. I'm glad to hear Fish and Wildlife's tracking. Kim, do you have that data, or Kim, who do we reach out to get it?
I can talk with them to get it for you. Yeah, I don't have it with me today, but we can certainly get that.
Okay.
And Noel Dodge and John Austin and Fish and Wildlife are the folks who primarily have it. You know, and I wanted to just flag that kind of change over time, appreciating that, you know, you're considering our update to the renewable energy standard that, as I understand it, is likely going to increase the requirements for in-state distributed generation, and potentially at rates similar to where we were in 2016, you know, somewhere around 70 plus megawatts per year. And I raise that just as a caution that as we kind of ramp back up to those rates of deployment, that I would just ask you all to be really thoughtful that you're clear in that legislation that the expectation is that those goals are achieved while complying with the state's environmental regulations, that those goals are not an excuse or an argument to not comply with the state's environmental laws, an argument to kind of trump natural resource protection over renewable energy. You know, ANR strongly supports the deployment of well-sited renewables. Climate change is a top priority for our agency, both mitigation, resilience, and adaptation. And we know that we're going to need more clean electricity to have a sustainable future here in the region. And we believe that can be done in a way that protects things like wetlands and significant natural resources, and is done so in balance. So I would just hope that as you're increasing these targets, you do so in a way that's clear to everyone that it's not an either or, that the expectation is that both of those things can be accomplished. I'd really also encourage that you think about what is going to need to happen at our community and regional levels to help folks absorb and understand the impacts of these changes. I think that Act 174 of 2016 that created the framework for municipal and regional energy plans was a great start, and we've seen a lot of communities embrace those opportunities. I don't know if that framework is going to be sufficient for the presence on the landscape of renewables in years. And that's not a criticism. It just wasn't, I think, designed with these sorts of deployment goals in mind. And this would be a good opportunity to maybe look at that framework and see if it could use some tweaks, because I want to see us successful. I want to see us achieve these regional and in-state goals. And what I've seen in the past is if it's done in a way that's not sensitive to environmental protection or communities, there's pushback and the pendulum swings in a direction that none of us want to see. And it often is counterproductive. And I think we're at a moment now where we're contemplating these changes where we could think collectively about not only where we want to land, but how we get there in a way that works for our communities and the environment. So I'll leave it. Those are my comments. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Representative Torrey.
Thank you. Do we currently have community benefit agreements as part of siting?
I don't, so this would be a good question for the PUC. It's not a requirement. There's a general, and I may get this wrong, but there's a general provision that these projects provide a public good to the state. That's what the whole certificate of public good is about. I believe for most renewable energy generation, especially at the net metered scale, there's an assumption that that good is being offered. And for larger projects, they may need to make more of a showing. That said, I know many developers do work with communities to see what their needs are, and in some instances do provide some benefits that are not required in regulation, but it's in their interest as a developer.
Further questions? I guess I'm curious if you would be able to provide us some assistance in providing the assurances of the sort of we can do both and ideas would be really helpful.
Yeah, happy to.
Thank you. I guess I'm curious about the public good piece of it. If Shana,
Elizabeth Schilling.
Elizabeth Schilling, I'm sorry. Just the public good piece of this and how there was a question just now about community benefit agreements and whether or not they're part of this or how the.
Generally, those would be separate from our Section 248 process. Those are often agreed to as part of like a separate settlement process.
Thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you.
We're going to take a 5-minute break and shift gears to our legislative council. 4 minutes.